Introducing whisky. The history of whisky is clouded in uncertainty, with many different theories about when and where it was first produced. What is known, though, is that the art of distillation only came to Scotland and Ireland around the 15th century. Regardless of when the first whisky was produced, it is a drink that is incredibly complex and can be made in many different ways. In the production of whisky, the slightest adjustment in how it is made can lead to massive differences in flavor. And so, over the centuries, the process of making whisky has been whittled down to a fine art. In this lesson on whisky, we will learn about how whisky is made, followed by the different types of whisky that are made around the world. First, let's take a look at how whisky is made. Whisky is an alcohol that is made from grain and water. To be more specific, the grain can be either wheat, barley, corn, or rye, depending on where the whisky is made and who is making it. Each ingredient will bring a slightly different flavor to the whisky. For example, barley gives off a wonderful cereal and nutty flavor. Rye has a strong spiciness. Wheat is subtle, elegant, and floral. And corn brings a delightful sweetness. Now let's take a look at the whisky making process. Step 1. Just as with every other spirit, the whole whisky making process starts with harvesting the grain that will be used. Step 2. Once this is done, the grain is soaked in water to start the grain germinating. Remember that it is during germination that the grain starts to convert its starch into sugar. Step 3. At the right time, the germination is then stopped by adding heat and drying out the grain. One of the special ways of doing this is in a big kiln or oven, where peat is used to fuel the oven. The smoke from the peat then makes its way into the liquid, giving it a medicinal, smoky flavor. Step 4. Once the grain is finished drying, the distiller will grind the grain to release the starch and add hot water to the resulting grist. The liquid that runs off is then collected and yeast is added to it to allow the fermentation process to begin. The liquid then starts to resemble beer, but the distillers call it wash. Step 5. This liquid is then distilled a number of times in a pot still. The number of times it is distilled will depend on where it is being made. Finally, step 6. The liquid is then placed in oak barrels and is left to mature for a minimum of 3 years. Now that we understand the magical process of whisky making, let's move on to learning about the different types of whisky. As mentioned, whisky is produced all over the world. While the traditional home of whisky is Scotland and Ireland, it is also made in Japan, South Africa, Australia, and even Taiwan. In this section, we will take a look at the main types of whisky. Firstly, Scotch whisky. Whisky is produced all over the world, but the most famous whiskies are produced in the cool climates of Scotland. These are known as Scotch whiskies and are generally made from malted barley and distilled twice in a pot still. Secondly, Irish whisky. The Irish are also very famous for making superb whisky and make theirs in a way that is very similar to their neighbours in Scotland. The main difference in the production process between Scotch and Irish whisky is that whiskies from Ireland are distilled 3 times instead of just twice. Another important difference is that in Ireland, whisky is spelt with an E, while in Scotland there is no E. And lastly, American bourbon. The most famous places for making bourbon are the USA and Canada. In order for whisky to be a bourbon, the main ingredient needs to be corn instead of malted barley. This means that if at least 51% of the whisky is made using corn, then it is classified as a bourbon. In the same way, America is also famous for its rye whisky, which needs to be at least 51% rye. The Americans follow the Irish spelling of whisky, and it is therefore also spelt with an E. That concludes the lesson on introducing whisky. Now that you know more about how whisky is made and the different types of whisky, you can enjoy the next lesson on the different categories of whisky.